Thank you. And I was just looking at your literary bibliography site and looking at Southampton. And one of the things I noticed that Jane Austen is not there. Southampton has the curious accolade of being the only place Jane Austen lived where she wrote nothing. So maybe that's why she's not there. That might say something about the city. Anyway, so I want to talk today. Thank you so much for the invitation, first and foremost. I want to talk today, of course, about metadata and metadata-based research. I'm going to focus on descriptive metadata. That is what I see as metadata that describes things like images and objects of that kind of form. And hopefully I won't talk for 20 minutes, but if I do, please shut me up. So as this is an event dedicated to metadata-driven research, I will talk about metadata-driven research more towards the end, and particularly in regards to stuff that I want to do that I'm starting to conceptualize within my work. This whole kind of talk is framed by a range of things I do with kind of historical cultures of metadata production. So, for example, I published recently an article that's on URGMA, which if anyone works with museums and knows the spectrum standard, it's the kind of very early form of spectrum that came out in the 1960s and 1970s, and a paper about how the museum profession in the UK kind of adapted to that kind of work. It's also framed by more critical work I do around contemporary metadata infrastructures, particularly Wikidata, most recently thinking about the ways in which biographical information about people is kind of flattened to some extent by the kind of presentist kind of focus of how Wikidata structures. It's not a criticism of Wikidata. Wikidata is amazing, an amazing community. But we built linked data about people from historical periods and found the kind of ways in which Wikidata didn't quite work for our situation. But I want to start today by talking about my turn away from metadata-driven research. By background, I'm a historian of the printed image in late Georgian London. So those kind of fascinating, rude, vibrant images associated with Napoleonic Wars in particular. And this is a set of materials that are blessed by the production of superb metadata by this individual. Mary Dorothy George, who worked at the British Museum between 1930 and 1954, and during that period produced a catalogue of political and personal satires, which is a monumental 7-volume piece of scholarship, 12,500 entries, spread over nearly 7,000 pages, catalogued British satirical prints, mostly prints published in London, but British satirical prints published between 1771 and 1832. And yes, she took 24 years to produce this set of metadata. And this is what I mean by that metadata. It has a distinctive style in terms of the main structure descriptions, which I will come to. But it also has this sort of book-like quality of metadata, right? We look at that and we know what the title is. We know where the fields are for the author. We know where the fields are for things like dates and place of publication. It's kind of implied by the page. And that's been transmitted over time, as I'll talk about, into our modern information systems. And what George tries to do in her descriptive parts is to create an image in the mind's eye of the reader of what they might find when they arrived at the British Museum print room. And this is really important because the catalogue contains no images. It's 7 volumes of just description of images. And so as I read through this, I hope you'll create an image in your mind's eye of what this print might be. So the enormously fat Mrs. Hobart sits in profile to the left in a small armchair, her right foot on a stool, her leg exposed. She places round its grotesque girth a ribbon garter, the central part of which is stiffened by a spring. Perched on her hair is a small straw hat with a high silk crown from which a veil hangs down her back. On the wall behind her is a picture. A small, thin man kneels before the statue of terrified Nina, believes him to be a ghost of her lover. Hopefully something roughly approaching this might be what was pictured in your mind's eye. And if you know nothing about the prints of the period, it probably wouldn't. If you know something about it, you maybe would. As an 18th century British historian, I am one of many who has worked with metadata like this to interpret and understand historical phenomena, often without looking at the images themselves directly. So, for example, in a book I published alarmingly long time ago in 2017, I used these descriptions from Mary Dorothy George as a basis from which to extract metadata about the place information within the images. So what places were being depicted. In this case, because it's about Mrs. Hobart and fashionable society, I would have assumed it took place in London. And I used the kind of locations in the metadata as a metric against which to kind of track and follow the career of one particular satirist, a man called Isaac Cruikshank, one of James Gilray's contemporaries, and to assert from that arguments about what the market could bear in relationship to prints was kind of more important than the whims of the satirists. So the content being driven by the kind of the market, while the content being driven by the whims of the artists, and use place-based imagery within the prints and within the metadata to kind of make that case. So far, so good. People use metadata about prints to think about the content of those images, using the metadata as a proxy for the images themselves. The problem was that the more I spent looking at Mary Dorothy George's metadata, the more her as a person really kind of nagged at me. And I started to think about her a little bit more. She was a very well-known historian in her time. She has a monumental history of London from 1930, which is incredibly well regarded. And I started to notice the kind of quirks in her work. So she was prudish, which I'll come back to. She liked narrative storytelling. So this conjuring in the mind's eye about telling a story about what you see in these images. She almost entirely ignores the backgrounds in these prints. So if you care about carpets and furniture, as many people do, you'll learn nothing from her metadata. You have to go to the prints themselves. She also mostly ignores backgrounds full of poor people. So if you're interested in representation of the poor, you're not going to get much from her prints. But going back to prudishness, the one that really stood out to me is that if you search the British Museum online, and in January 2008, the metadata from Dorothy George's descriptions in the printed books ended up on what was launched as British Museum Online in 2008. If you search that for words to find things that are the more scatological prints, the ruder prints of the period, you're not going to find the things you expect to find. And that's because of the way she structures and talks about things that I think she didn't feel comfortable describing. So in this image, for example, on the right-hand side, as you see it, you can see William Pitt pulling a bunch of coins from John Ball's arse, which she describes as pulling a rope of coins from John's posteriors. She really likes the word posteriors. And if you use that, you'll find a great deal of prints about scatology that you wouldn't otherwise know to find. Would a modern audience use posteriors? Not sure. And it goes further. She uses phrases like the effluvia evacuating from the royal posterior, which effectively means the king is shitting. So you cannot get at some of this stuff unless you really know and get into her head. And so I kind of started to lack trust in the metadata as a proxy for the collection that described it, and decided I wanted to know more about her. So I did what historians do. I went to the archive at the British Museum and learned what I could about her working practices as a cataloguer at the museum. And there's lots here to learn from the British Museum's own archives. The one bit I really love is that during the Second World War, lots of the London's national collections were evacuated to the National Library of Wales because they have it sits on a big rock, and they drilled a hole in the rock and shoved the collections in there. And all the curators went there with the collections and had a lovely time. Because they weren't being bothered by readers and the public who wanted to access their collections, and they did a huge amount of cataloguing during this particular period. I then decided to collaborate with a corpus linguist, Andrew Salway, to see what a kind of inductive, iterative research approach to the data itself could reveal about her style. And it was frankly fascinating. So one example that I often come back to is about her clear, direct, assertive language. This is a table of negative keyness words, which is a pretty crude way of thinking about what someone doesn't say. But these are the words that occur unusually infrequent in George's descriptions compared to British National Corpus, so standard English language. And we find things like was and were because she's talking about prints, not the past tense, which is quite obvious. But we also notice words like would, could, and might appearing within there. And this wasn't normal. This lack of what we would call hedging, this lack of uncertainty wasn't normal in cataloguing for the period. Many cataloguers she worked with at the British Museum, at the National Library of Wales, were much more uncertain in the way they catalogued the visual collections they were working with. So this wasn't normal. And what we also just argued through this work was that this wasn't her kind of foreshadowing the kind of hyper-objective, anonymized metadata production practices that became common in the Anglophone world between the 1950s and 1990s, before the kind of postmodern archival turn. Rather, we argued it was about gender. Mary Dorothy George fits the pattern of early women scholars, as the historian Bonnie Smith has called it, of, quote, performing objectivity. That is, adopting methods that enable them to demonstrate their rigor to a conservative and patriarchal profession, which Bonnie Smith argues is why many women in the early 20th century went into social history, more quantitative social history and economic history in particular. And George in her cataloguing work seems to be doing something similar here. We also started to find further quirks when we experimented a bit more with the data. So I had a slightly techie lockdown, and I trained an early language model, GPT-2, I think it was, inflected it with all Dorothy George's 1.5 million words and made it speak like her. And it produced lots of rubbish descriptions which made no sense, because early language models did that. But it also produced a number of descriptions of what I think of as imaginary descriptions of imaginary objects that fit her tone and fit her style. So, for example, this one, the regent, very drunk, sups in the kitchen at the pavilion at a table covered with invitations to dinner. That's the regent, later George IV. He worked at the pavilion. He lived at the pavilion in Brighton. That makes sense. He leans back in his chair, pugnacious and insolent. That's how he was thought of at the time. His eye and mouth watering. Then it gets a bit rubbish. And one of the problems with this is it often had people with two heads, four hands, etc., etc. I then also had fun and turned these into images and sort of made imaginary images based on imaginary metadata about prints, if that makes sense. But one of the things I noticed from this that I hadn't noticed from working with her metadata for many years was that there's this phrase she uses, often starting many descriptions, and the language model really picked this out. I've made hundreds of thousands of these things from the language model to have a look through them. And that's a citizen. She used this phrase, a citizen. And what I realized going back to the prints is that she uses this to describe men, specifically white men, white British men, and white British men roughly between their mid-20s and their mid-40s. Every other unnamed character, so people that aren't famous people like Mrs. Hobart, so women, children, foreigners, are described through their characteristics. There being a woman, there being a child, their presumed national identity. And what we realized then was that within this particular data set, unmarked whiteness is sort of within this metadata at a vast scale through this just one phrase, a citizen. What we realized then was that this process that had gradually converted this book metadata into microfilm, into database, into online, which is this journey that it took over the 20th century, and indeed briefly into linked open data before the British Museum decided to kill that particular useful service. What had happened was that George's very temporally specific choices, contexts, and circumstances had been thrust nearly a century into the future. But this knowledge was largely absent from how we used her metadata. If you go to the British Museum catalogue, you'll see her descriptions almost entirely unedited. And if you go down sort of about 8 fields or so on the left-hand side, you'll eventually see a kind of reference to where this description comes from. But that's not primarily how we use metadata. We don't go to that field very often, either as a visual user or a computational user. We also worked out from this that reparative cataloging, so changing a word or two, and there are problematic vocabularies undoubtedly in our metadata, would improve things for contemporary users, but not fundamentally. Instead, as with every cataloging endeavor, Dorothy George's work is shaped by its circumstance of production. And what we started to see in the language that she used was that historical specificity was much more structural, the ways in which she spoke rather than specifically she used. What we did after this was trace the transmission of that metadata from the UK to the US. from the British Museum, specifically to the Lewis Walpole Library over the course of the mid-20th century. And what we tried to do was analyze the kind of pattern of edits for similar prints. So prints in both institutions, which have similarities, how are they kind of moving, how that metadata, descriptive metadata about them moving across the Atlantic. We looked at the ways that Lewis Walpole Library diverged from Dorothy George, and they certainly did, likely. But at the same time, it was clear that their cataloguers were inspired by her. Indeed, the current curator there, Cindy Roman, would say, everyone used her as the Bible, effectively, on how to describe these prints. And that came up through some computational pairwise matching, which gave us instances of metadata in the Lewis Walpole collection for prints that are not in the British Museum that were shown to be similarly, linguistically similar enough that they seem like they're about the same thing in the British Museum. So here you've got two records. I won't read them both. One of them is from the Lewis Walpole Library. It's a description of a print that is not in the British Museum. The other is one from the British Museum that is in the British Museum. And our pairwise matching pulled those out as examples of high likelihood of being about the same thing, high likelihood of having the same characteristics, even though neither one of those prints are not shared between the two institutions. So that kind of signature of Mary Dorothy George's metadata was there in the Lewis Walpole decades after she was writing in London and in Wales. Here, though, I think we get back to metadata analysis. I mentioned before that kind of hyper-objective, anonymized metadata production practices that rose to prominence in culture institutions in the Anglophone world in the 1950s to about the 1990s. From what I can see, this was when much of the metadata that we use today was made. In cultural heritage at least, often imported into systems during a kind of burst of digitization in the early 2000s to about 2015. So you digitize something, you go back to an old catalog, you put it into your modern catalog, you maybe play with it a bit, but you run out of resources. That gets used as your access point. One principle established then that continues largely to this day is the anonymity of the cataloguer. The metadata is produced by the institution with rules and procedures that produce objectivity, not the individual. But since the kind of postmodern turn archival science, we've known that to be a bit of a fiction. And wonderful anti-colonial work in particular in heritage, for example, heritage metadata production. I'm thinking of people like Kathleen Lowther with the person-centered cataloging, and Nanda Rutherford is driving kind of different approaches to cataloging in modern institutions that include centering the cataloger. And as part of this work, we did a number of workshops that were about trying to center the cataloger within their work and think about what agendas might be for future work with legacy catalog data. So without wanting to out catalogers for their choices, because we all make bad choices that seem sensible at the time and bad later, what I think I'm moving towards is work that tries to tease out the kind of plurality and multivocality of a catalogue. So this is the British Museum, the earliest snapshot of collection database from the Wayback Machine, 2008. It shows about 250,000 records. There's now about 2 million records. And it reminds us, I think, that these catalogues are always iterative, kind of bricolage affairs. I've done some pilot work with the British Library, actually, to think about this. So looking at the incunabular catalogues in particular and thinking about the ways they can use understanding of the production of the catalogue to improve how they provide access to incunabular collections. But what I want to do next is much more expansive. I want to take whole catalogues and use its metadata across categories, not just the descriptive bits. And I want to try and infer clusters of data based on the cataloging characteristics. That is not pseudonyms of catalogers or dates that data was written, where it exists in authority files. And one of the curios, I think, of modern software development in cultural heritage is that curators often want to know the edit history of their collection metadata, but they don't have access to it, which is an oddity. But rather, I'm interested in the kind of metadata itself. I want to find clusters of data, identify pockets of oddness, and use that to start defining types and genres and characteristics and signatures. We got part of the way there with the Lewis Walpole work towards the British and their divergence from Mary Dorothy George. But I want to do that without a comparator. I don't know how to do this yet, and I'm not sure where to start, but this is the direction of travel which this research is going in next. Final thing then. Why do I want to do this? Why do I think this is important? Why is this my contribution to this meeting? Well, of course, first, I think that investigating how metadata is made gives us a richer understanding of the metadata we use as proxy for collections. That's where I started. I wanted to use this as a proxy and realized it was a kind of faulty proxy. All metadata is faulty proxies, but I want to know the detail of that. So that's obviously one thing. But also, I want to use this work to elevate the cause of that refraction, the kind of the lens through which we get to collections via metadata, or the causes of that, which of course is people and the ways in which they work. Now, I'm not saying we don't know that people do and continue to make metadata, but I think often this gets forgotten in more public discourse. Cataloging in the heritage sector in particular is criminally underfunded. It isn't shiny, it isn't new, it isn't AI, but it might actually be able to be improved in ways that support machine learning processes. And I think the value of doing this work again and improving metadata, investing in its improvement for discovery, for understanding, for equity, isn't necessarily appreciated. Telling stories about the quirks in the metadata, the patterns of difference, the apparent influences, the areas that need revision and review, I think draws attention to the vital labor of catalogers in making data and continuing to make data, in particular in the heritage sector. So I'm going to end then with a plea. Many of us are here because we work with metadata made by cultural heritage institutions. I would like to think that we can make a good percentage of our work about keeping those people who make that metadata employed and in good jobs and fully supported in the work that they do. Thank you.
Thank you, James, very much for your speech. Are there any questions? Who the first? Nico? Thanks very much. This is really insightful and really good. It's a lot of different kind of thoughts into mind, and especially, I mean, that of course we are doing two different things. So one is the cataloging and describing, like you explained, and then you would like to have these general type of rules that are applied. And I think it's quite, I mean, that often we forget that the metadata is collections of collections of collections of descriptions. And what you said at the last point, that finding those pockets that aren't so obvious or odd in some way. I think like one of the most interesting things there are the very useful parts described that usually aren't. And oftentimes they are derived from somewhere. So like this distinction between those who describe and those who make the rules. And sometimes the rules are made by those who are described. So for example, in the Finnish National Bibliography, the only reason why it is very good in genre with respect to dissertations is that they have used one historian's work as basis of that. And when you look at the others, I mean, dissertations, many other catalogues, national catalogues, much poorer. But finding those pockets that are actually good and then thinking that why it is so. So then getting to this idea that maybe what we are dealing with isn't something that is made by these general rules that actually always work. And then another thought that came to my mind is the amount of who invented 635 fields of description when you have 3 entries in 300 and 0 in 155 or something. So meaning that there's a lot of ways that people feel that things should be described, but maybe no one is actually using. And where to strike the balance and why this is this way. And especially when it comes to images that are compared to bibliodata in general, much more difficult, maybe even more so, depending on the individual collection who's cataloging. Yeah, I'll stop now.
I guess one of the things that you made me think is that for fields that are often very fastidious in their ways of working, it's curious to me and interesting that there's often a lack of documentation about the practices that people use. Most of it is institutional memory. You really need to go and talk to individuals who've been involved in institutions for a long time, who can tell you things. Sitting in the Lewis Walpole print room, looking at their annotated catalogues that came over from London, that then get used as the basis for their catalogue cards, that get used as the basis for their online descriptions, was fascinating because the curators there could say to me, oh, that's so-and-so who wrote that. I know their hand. And their hand then translates into the metadata. But the kind of the process is often not that well described or written down. I think these things are obviously changing, but they're often not. And so that thing you said about choices of using fields, it does come down to instinctive local decision making about why fields are used in certain ways. And in other projects where we've tried to pull together metadata that ostensibly used the same cataloging rules, as it were, and standards, and try to bring them together, you immediately find problems and complexities. So yeah, you said metadata as a collection of collections, and that is undoubtedly my opinion. And I think there are really good structural reasons why institutions don't talk about that. Like if you're government funded, for example, you're not going to turn around to government when asking for money and say, well, our catalogues aren't that canonical. They're just a series of choices people made over a few hundred years about how to describe stuff. They're going to go, well, you don't know anything, do you? Right. So I think there's real political implications for sort of opening this out a little bit more and working with institutions carefully to help them achieve the things they want to achieve with their metadata without sort of shaming them or outing people or make them feel like they don't know anything. And it's been, some of you will know I used to work at the British Library. So in a way, that's why I've got that connect. But it's been really lovely working with them on the incunabula stuff, because they're starting to realize that I'm not an incunabula expert, but starting to realize the ways in which having a set of catalogues produced, I think in that case, over about 120 years, meant that there were rules pulled from the really early stages of incunabula collecting at what was the British Museum, which have kind of filtered through over time, but then people have made local adaptations in, say, the 1960s, for example, which mean that they're not commensurable and interoperable as printed catalogues anymore. But there's points where they need to figure out what the logics were for those changes to then think about how they use that as part of their online search, discovery, etc. today, and make data available for researchers like people here to do work with those collections. Thank you.
Two questions. In your research, were there any problem to access the data? And as you work with descriptive metadata, most of the time, descriptive metadata has some principles, either international principles or institutional principles. Sometimes they are documented, sometimes not. And sometimes this document is available, sometimes not. So do you run into this kind of problem?
So in terms of access to the data, so I've worked primarily with British Museum and Lewis Walpole Library data. British Museum data I was able to get hold of. And then when they turned off the linked open data service, that's not something you can access computationally anymore. So if you want British Museum metadata, it's now hard. I think there is a mirror somewhere of the collections at some point. I think Matthew Lincoln produced it at some point and made a torrent out of it. So I think there's still on academic torrents, which is a modestly used resource. But yeah, it's out there somewhere, but locked in time somewhere in the mid-20 teams or something. So that is challenging now, but wasn't for us. And I have this. And if anyone's interested, by the way, in all the words, oh, you can't see it there very easily. Let's go back to one of the, oh no, actually that wasn't got words. There are lots of captions in these prints. We made a separate data set of all the captions, which we published, available somewhere. So if anyone wants a data set of things people say in prints in Britain in the late 18th and 19th century, we have that, which is a fun little side collection. Lewis Walpole we went directly to them and worked with them, and they gave us direct access to their metadata, including some of the authority files that give us a sense of when metadata was made, or at least the last time it was edited. I think now, since Lewis Walpole, as part of Yale, has published the large sort of open metadata collections that they've been working on, that may be a little bit easier to get hold of. But at the time, it was very much a manual process of they exported a database and gave it to us. But they were also working closely with us as a project partner at that time. So that's where that happened. On metadata principles, very quickly, both the Dorothy George stuff and the Lewis Walpole Library do have some documents that try to sort of explain why they go about what they do. In Dorothy George's case, each printed catalogue has like an introduction. It's mostly about the collections, but there's a little bit in there about her kind of logics and the way in which she approached the work. But I think the thing that's important to note about the catalogues is that their primary usage was not by sort of going to a page and just reading it, or going to it's date organized, so going to a date. The primary way of using it was to go to the index, and they produced detailed indices by people, indices by place, indices by all sorts of sort of classifications by different social cultural characteristic, which would be, if you use the physical one, how you would use it, which is why the microfilm was almost pointless, because all you really wanted to do was go to the back of the book and look at the indices and then flick through to the bits in the book you wanted to look at, in terms of the pages that were about Napoleon or the pages that were about satires on dress, for example. So they're interesting in that the logics are sort of embedded to some extent, I think, in the way in which the indices were produced. Lewis Walpole Library have a small 5-ish pages sheet of paper that is printed and available if you go into the reading room to look at, and that's it. At some point, someone went, this is how we're going to catalogue our prints. And I've got some photographs of that somewhere, and that's about it. And that was all of the logic they ever used. And from that point onwards, it was based on, George does it really well, we replicate these processes, and then over time, they've iterated the way in which they might rephrase her vocabulary. There's one of the prints that we focused on in one of our published pieces of work was, there's a print which shows a number of people running down to the beach by Thomas Rowlandson, and it has a number of people using walking sticks. And Dorothy George describes them as cripples and invalids, which Lewis Walpole knew they needed to change, and at some point revised that to a more appropriate set of vocabularies. So they did make some choice at some point about vocabulary, but it's hard to know whether they had a list of words or they were just relying on cataloguers having a sense of what was appropriate at a given time. But thank you.
Thank you, James. There might be one question in the chat.
Yeah, there is one question from Linda Jansova from Czech National Library. Do you have any idea why the British Library has stopped publishing its open data set? If my understanding of the situation is correct, she's sending the list that contains 154 items, but the latest addition comes from 2023.
British Library.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't work at the British Library anymore, but what I do know is that they suffered a major cyber attack a couple of years ago, as some of you will know, and I suspect that is most of the reason why that hasn't been happening. So in a way, there is an interesting moment right now for the library to think about how it might refresh or change the ways in which it provides metadata, because they're having to rebuild their infrastructures broadly from scratch. So it may well be they find a better way of publishing open data sets in the future. They had already done lots of good work already, but a better way of doing that. But I think at the moment their focus is on understanding the extent of the cyber attack and gradually getting services up and running. As a former employee, I was aware, and this is public knowledge, but I was aware, for example, that their priority was making sure that personal information about members of staff hadn't been published online. So they started there and then gradually got to the collection stuff. Anyone who works with web archives, for example, will know that UK Web Archive is still not up, even though they are continuing to collect the web at extraordinary scale. So I think there's a sort of like, unfortunately, there's a delay going on, but there are really great people still working there who I know are really committed to publishing open metadata.
But I just choose one to this. There's a 20-page long report about the issue what they did and how they would like to prevent future things and how to rebuild the collections and so forth. Anybody is interested in lots of papers.
But it's an interesting example how data that is important to groups like this can be lost or temporarily made unavailable by virtue of a cyber attack that's got nothing to do with data about something like this, that they were after personnel records ultimately, but in the midst of doing that managed to ruin a lot of the ways in which catalogue data was published online, and potentially lost collections, though that didn't actually happen in the end, thankfully. So it's an interesting moment of thinking about how cybersecurity interacts with computational research, because it does.
Okay, perfect. Thank you once again, James, for your talk.